The rain had been falling all evening. Not hard, just a steady, quiet kind of drizzle that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Inside the piano bar on West 54th Street, the air was warm and smelled faintly of aged wood, expensive whiskey, and something floral. Maybe the lilies in the vase near the grand piano. The lighting was low, golden, the kind that made everyone look a little more interesting than they really were. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Laughter bubbled up now and then, polished and practiced, the kind you hear when people are trying to impress someone they barely know. In the middle of it all, she moved like a shadow. Not because she wanted to be unseen, though she'd grown used to it, but because that's what the job demanded. She carried a tray balanced on one palm, 3 martinis and 2 glasses of sparkling water, each garnished just so. Her black dress was simple, knee-length with a white apron tied neatly at the waist. Her hair was pulled back, not too tight, not too loose. She'd learned long ago that in places like this, how you looked mattered almost as much as how you served. But more than that, she'd learned to disappear. She'd been working here for 8 months. Before that, she'd bounced between coffee shops, late-night diners, and a short, miserable stint at a corporate catering gig where she'd once spilled soup on a venture capitalist's handmade loafers. This place was different. It wasn't just a bar, it was an institution. The kind of spot where diplomats, gallery owners, and the occasional movie star came not to be seen, but to feel like they were part of something rare. There was no sign outside, just a brass number on the door. You had to know someone to get in or at least look like you belonged. She didn't belong. Not really. But she'd gotten good at pretending. Her feet ached. They always did by this point in the shift. She'd worn the same pair of black flats for 3 weeks straight because the soles of her other pair had split open one rainy Tuesday, and she hadn't had time or money to replace them. Still, she walked with her back straight, her steps light, her smile ready but not too eager. Too eager made people uncomfortable. Too distant made them feel ignored. It was a tightrope, and she'd learned to walk it without looking down. As she set down a martini in front of a man in a charcoal suit, he barely glanced up from his phone. She didn't mind. She'd stopped taking it personally months ago. What stung more was the silence, the way people talked over her, around her, as if she weren't even there. Like she was part of the furniture. A vase, a coat rack, something useful but forgettable. She returned to the service station near the kitchen, where the other servers were swapping stories in hushed tones. One of them, a guy with a sharp jawline and a tattoo of a treble clef behind his ear, was complaining about a tip. $20 for a 2-hour tab? I might as well be working at a diner. She didn't join in. She never did. Not because she thought she was better than them, far from it, but because she'd learned that sharing too much in places like this could backfire. Once, early on, she'd mentioned she used to play piano. Not just play, study, seriously. At a school people whispered about in music circles. The others had laughed, not unkindly, but with that edge of disbelief that said, "Sure you did." After that, she kept her past locked away, like a book she'd closed and tucked under the bed. She refilled water glasses, cleared empty plates, smiled when needed, and vanished when not. The night wore on. The bar filled slowly. The kind of crowd that arrived in pairs or small groups, speaking in low voices about art auctions, real estate in Lisbon, a new gallery opening in Berlin. No one shouted. No one stumbled. This wasn't that kind of place. Even the drunk ones knew how to hold it together. Then, just after 10, the manager appeared at the edge of the room, his face tight. He was a wiry man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a habit of rubbing his temples when stressed. Right now, he was rubbing hard. He caught her eye and motioned her over. She approached, keeping her expression neutral. "Everything okay?" "The pianist," he said, voice low and strained. "He's not coming. Food poisoning. Or so he claims," she nodded. It wasn't her problem. Or so she thought. "We've got that delegation from Zurich in booth 7, he went on, glancing toward the far corner. "They're here to discuss the new cultural exchange program. Big donors. Big expectations. And they specifically asked for live piano tonight. Not recorded. Not some playlist, live." She felt her stomach tighten. She knew where this was going. She'd seen it before. Last-minute scrambles, favors called in, panic disguised as professionalism. "I know you used to." He trailed off, watching her carefully. "You ever sit in before?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly, he didn't push. Just looked at her, really looked, for the first time in months. Not as staff, but as a person. I'm not asking you to perform, he said gently. I'm asking you to keep the room from going silent. Just play something, anything, 10 minutes. That's all I need. She opened her mouth to say no, to explain that it had been years, that she hadn't touched a real piano since, well, since everything fell apart. That the last time she played in front of anyone, it ended in tears and a slammed door and a letter she still couldn't bring herself to reread. But then she looked past him, toward the grand piano in the center of the room. It sat under a soft spotlight, its polished surface catching the light like dark water. It was a Steinway, old but lovingly maintained. She'd passed it 100 times, never daring to touch it, not even to dust it. Every time she walked by, she felt a tug in her chest like a string pulled taut between her ribs. She thought of her grandmother, who'd saved grocery money for years to buy her first keyboard, who'd sat beside her every evening after work, humming along as she practiced scales. Music isn't in your fingers, the old woman used to say. It's in your bones. And once it's there, it never leaves. She swallowed. Okay, she said, so softly she wasn't sure he heard her. He did. His shoulders dropped an inch. Thank you. She untied her apron slowly, folding it with care as if it were something precious. She smoothed her dress, took a breath, and walked toward the piano. The room hadn't noticed yet. People were still talking, sipping, leaning in. But as she approached the bench, a few heads turned. Not with excitement, more with mild curiosity, like they were watching someone step into a role they hadn't auditioned for. She sat down. The bench was cool beneath her. She ran her fingers over the keys, not pressing, just feeling. They were smooth, slightly worn in the middle C area. Familiar, foreign, alive. Her hands hovered. She hadn't planned anything. No peace in mind, no clever arrangement to impress. All she had was whatever was inside her right now, the exhaustion, the fear, the strange quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost it completely. She closed her eyes and played. The first note was soft, almost a whisper, a single C held just long enough to hang in the air. Then another. Then a chord, minor, unresolved. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even pretty, not in the usual sense, but it was honest. It sounded like rain on a fire escape, like a bus braking too hard at 2 a.m., like the ache of missing someone you couldn't call anymore. Around her, the room began to change. A woman stopped mid-sentence, her fork halfway to her mouth. A man lowered his phone. The bartender paused while pouring a drink. Even the waitstaff froze, trays in hand, eyes wide. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just listened, because what filled the room wasn't just music. It was a story. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this quiet, trembling beginning, would ripple outward in ways she couldn't imagine. Careers would shift. Strangers would become allies. A forgotten dream would find its way back to the light. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there was only the piano, the silence between the notes, and the feeling, faint but undeniable, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her fingers moved without thought, guided by something deeper than memory. She played a melody she'd written years ago, during a winter when the heat kept cutting out and she'd wrapped herself in blankets just to keep her hands warm enough to practice. She'd never played it for anyone, hadn't even remembered it until this second. But now it poured out of her, raw and tender, like a letter finally sent after years in a drawer. The man from Zurich set down his wine glass. His companion leaned forward. In the back, near the coat check, an older woman with silver hair closed her eyes and smiled, not at anyone, just to herself as if remembering something sweet. The manager stood near the bar, arms crossed, but his usual tension was gone. He looked surprised, maybe even moved. She didn't notice any of it. She was lost in the sound, in the way the keys responded to her touch, in the strange relief of letting go. For years she'd carried music like a secret shame, something she'd failed at, something she'd abandoned. But now, in this room full of strangers who'd never seen her as anything but a server, she realized something simple and profound. Music hadn't left her. She'd left it. And it had waited. When the final chord faded, soft, lingering like smoke, it took a few seconds for the room to remember how to breathe. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Not loudly, not showily, but with genuine warmth. Others joined. Not a standing ovation, not a roar, but something quieter, more meaningful. A recognition. She opened her eyes. Her hands were shaking. Not from nerves anymore, but from something else. Something like belonging. She stood, smoothed her dress again, and walked back toward the service station. No one spoke to her. No one needed to. The air had changed. She felt it in her skin. As she picked up her apron, she didn't tie it back on right away. She just held it, feeling the weight of it in her hands. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something new. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city exhaled. And somewhere, deep in the heart of a piano that had waited patiently for years, a song had finally found its way home. The silence after the last note hung in the air like mist, soft, fragile, and impossible to ignore. She stood by the piano for a heartbeat too long, unsure whether to bow, to speak, or simply vanish back into the shadows where she'd spent the last 8 months. Her fingers still tingled, not from the cold or fatigue, but from something deeper, something that had been buried so long she'd almost convinced herself it was gone for good. Music. Not just notes on a page, but the kind that lives in your chest, that hums under your skin when the world gets too loud. She turned slowly, eyes down, and walked back toward the service counter. Her apron was still folded in her hands. She didn't put it on, not yet. The manager met her halfway, his usual briskness replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe, or awe. He didn't say good job, he didn't need to. The way he looked at her, really looked, said everything. You okay? He asked, voice lower than usual. She nodded, but her throat felt tight. She wasn't sure if she was okay. She felt like she'd just stepped off a ledge and discovered mid-air that she could fly. Back at the counter, the other servers watched her like she'd grown wings. No one teased her. No one made a joke. They just stood there, trays in hand, eyes wide with something that looked a lot like wonder. One of them, a woman who'd once rolled her eyes when she'd accidentally mentioned Juilliard, now gave her a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. And right then, that was enough. She leaned against the cool marble edge of the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from the strange electric rush of being seen, not as a waitress, not as someone who cleared plates and refilled water glasses, but as someone who had something to say, and said it without words. The room had returned to its usual rhythm, but it was different now. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful. People lingered over their drinks longer than usual. The man from Zurich leaned toward his companion and said something that made the other nod slowly, eyes still on the piano. Even the bartender, usually all business, paused while polishing a glass as if replaying the melody in his head. She watched it all from the edge of the room, feeling both part of it and apart from it. Like she'd stepped through a door she didn't know existed. Then the manager was beside her again. "They want you to play another set," he said quietly. "Just 10 more minutes. "If you're up for it," she almost said no. The old fear crept back, the fear that the first piece had been a fluke, that she'd used up all her courage in one go. What if the next song wasn't as honest? What if she stumbled? What if they realized she wasn't really one of them? But then she remembered her grandmother's voice, clear as if she were standing right there. "You don't play for them. You play for the truth inside you." She took a breath. Okay, this time she didn't hesitate. She walked back to the piano with her head a little higher, her steps a little surer. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes, not to shut the world out, but to listen to what was inside. She didn't choose a famous piece. Didn't reach for Chopin or Gershwin or anything she thought would impress. Instead, she let her fingers find their own way. They landed on a melody she'd written during a summer when she worked nights at a laundromat, folding strangers' clothes while listening to the hum of dryers and the distant wail of sirens. It had started as a way to stay awake, to keep her mind from spiraling into despair. She'd hummed it under her breath, then tapped it out on tabletops, then finally scribbled it onto a napkin during a break. She'd never played it on a real piano, not until now. The notes came out slow at first, tentative, like someone testing the ice before stepping onto a frozen pond. But then they grew stronger, weaving together into something warm and aching and full of quiet hope. It wasn't perfect. There was a missed note here, a rushed phrase there, but that only made it more real. Because real life isn't polished. It's messy, uneven, full of cracks, and that's where the light gets in. Halfway through, she opened her eyes. And that's when she saw him. An older man sat alone at a small table near the back, away from the main crowd. He hadn't been there before, or if he had, she hadn't noticed him. He wore a dark overcoat, slightly rumpled, and held a teacup in both hands like it was something precious. His eyes were closed, but not in sleep, in deep listening. The kind of listening that doesn't just hear the notes, but feels the spaces between them. She almost lost her place. But she kept going. Because something about the way he sat, the stillness, the reverence, told her he understood. Not just the music, but the story behind it. The years of silence, the fear of being forgotten, the courage it took to try again. When she finished, the applause was warmer this time, less surprised, more grateful. People smiled at her as she passed. One woman reached out and gently touched her arm. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She returned to the counter, this time tying her apron back on. Not because she had to, but because it felt like grounding herself, like reminding herself that she was still the same person, even if the world around her had shifted. The rest of the night passed in a blur. She served drinks, cleared plates, made small talk, but everything felt different. Lighter, as if a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying had been lifted. Even her feet didn't ache as much. When her shift ended just after midnight, she stood outside the bar for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes in the hours between midnight and dawn. Streetlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement. A taxi rolled by, its headlights cutting through the mist. She started walking toward the subway, but her steps were slower than usual. She wasn't in a rush to get home. For the first time in years, she didn't dread the silence of her apartment. She welcomed it. Because now that silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. As she walked, she replayed the night in her head. Not the applause, not the looks, but the feeling of her fingers on the keys. The way the piano had responded to her touch, like it had been waiting, like it remembered her. She thought about the man in the back with the teacup. She wondered who he was. A musician? A teacher? Just someone who loved music? She'd probably never know. But his presence had meant something. It had reminded her that music isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Back in her apartment, a tiny one-bedroom on the edge of the Bronx with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like a metronome, she didn't go straight to bed. Instead, she sat on the floor by the window, wrapped in a blanket, and stared out at the city lights. She pulled out her phone and opened a voice memo app. She hadn't used it in years, but tonight, she needed to capture something before it slipped away. She hummed a few notes, the beginning of a new melody, one that had been forming in her mind since she left the bar. It was rough, unfinished, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. She fell asleep with the phone still in her hand, the city humming outside her window like a lullaby. The next morning, she woke to a text from the manager. "Can you play tonight? Full set. 8 to 11. Pays triple." She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone down and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Her hands didn't shake this time. They were steady, ready. She didn't answer right away. Not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to be sure she was saying yes for the right reasons. Not for the money, not for the attention, but because she missed it. Because it was part of her, like breathing. Later that afternoon, she went back to the bar during daylight hours when it was empty and quiet. The manager let her in without a word. She sat at the piano again, alone this time, and played for no one but herself. The same pieces from last night, plus a few new ones she'd been too scared to try before. The room felt different in the daylight, less mysterious, more intimate, like it was letting her in. She stayed for 2 hours, losing herself in the music, rediscovering the joy of it. Not the pressure, not the expectations, just the pure, simple act of creating something beautiful out of nothing. When she finally stood to leave, she noticed something on the piano bench. A small folded piece of paper. She opened it. In neat, careful handwriting, it read, "You reminded me why I ever loved music." A listener. She didn't know who'd left it. Maybe the man with the teacup. Maybe someone else. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had listened. Really listened. That night, she returned to the bar in a simple black dress, no apron this time. She walked to the piano with her head high. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she finally believed she belonged there. The room fell silent as she sat down, not out of obligation, but out of anticipation. They knew now. They knew she wasn't just filling in. She was sharing something real. And as her fingers touched the keys, she didn't think about the crowd, the critics, the past, or the future. She just played, because for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding, she was home. The room didn't just go quiet this time. It leaned in. Not physically, not all at once, but in that subtle way people do when something true cuts through the noise of their lives. She sat at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, not rushing, not performing. She waited until the last murmur faded, until the clink of ice in a glass stopped, until even the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar seemed to hold its breath. Then she began. This wasn't the polished set she might have played years ago in recital halls with perfect lighting and judges scribbling notes in leather-bound books. This was something else, something raw, stitched together from bus rides at dawn, sleepless nights, and the kind of loneliness that only city living can bring. She started with a simple phrase, just 5 notes, repeated like a heartbeat. Then she layered over it a melody that sounded like rain tapping on a fire escape, then like footsteps echoing down an empty subway tunnel, then like the quiet sigh someone makes when they finally let go of something they've been carrying too long. People didn't just listen. They felt it. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes without realizing she was doing it. A man who'd been checking his watch every 30 seconds now sat perfectly still, his fingers curled loosely around his glass like he'd forgotten it was there. Even the staff paused in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, trays in hand, caught in the current of something they couldn't name but deeply recognized. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the room had softened around her. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition, like they were hearing a part of themselves they'd forgotten existed. Halfway through the piece, she made a small mistake. Her left hand slipped on a chord just slightly out of time. In another life, in another setting, that would have sent her spiraling, back to the days when perfection was the only acceptable offering, when one wrong note could ruin everything. But tonight she didn't flinch. She let the note hang, bent it slightly, turned the stumble into something new, and in that moment the music became even more human, because life isn't perfect, and neither is healing. When she finished, there was no immediate applause, just silence, deep, respectful, full of feeling. Then slowly one person began to clap, then another. Not loud, not showy, but steady, like they were saying thank you without using words. She stood, gave a small nod, not a bow, just a quiet acknowledgement, and walked back to the edge of the room. Her heart was pounding, but not from nerves. From something warmer, something like belonging. The manager approached, eyes bright. They're asking if you'll play another set tomorrow. And the night after that, in fact. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. One of the guests left his card. Said he's in the business, wants to talk. She took the card without looking at it. She didn't need to know who he was yet. What mattered was that someone had heard her. Not as a novelty, not as a gimmick, but as an artist. Later, after her set ended and the last guest had drifted out into the cool night, she stayed behind. The bar was empty except for the bartender wiping down the counter and the manager counting receipts. She sat back at the piano, alone this time, and played for no one but herself. Not for an audience, not for a chance at something bigger, just because she could. Because it felt like coming home after a long, long journey. She played a piece she'd written during the winter she couldn't afford heat, when she'd wrapped herself in 3 sweaters and played with stiff fingers just to keep the dream alive. She played another she'd composed on a cracked keyboard in a borrowed practice room, the kind with flickering lights and a door that never quite shut. Each note carried a memory, a struggle, a quiet act of defiance against giving up. When she finally stood to leave, the manager handed her an envelope. "Your pay," he said, "plus a little extra. From the guests." She opened it later in the quiet of her apartment. Inside was more money than she'd made in 2 weeks of double shifts. But tucked beneath the bills was a note, handwritten on thick cream paper. "You didn't just play music tonight. You told a story. And it was the most honest thing I've heard in years." She read it 3 times. Then she pinned it to the wall above her bed, right next to the faded photo of her grandmother holding her tiny hands over piano keys. The next few nights blurred together in the best possible way. She played every evening, her sets growing longer, her confidence deeper. She didn't change her style to please anyone. If anything, she went further inward, digging up melodies she'd buried out of fear or shame. One night she played a piece about losing someone she loved, a slow, aching tune that made the room feel like it was holding its breath. Another night she played something joyful, full of syncopated rhythms and bright dancing notes inspired by the sound of kids laughing in the playground below her window. People started coming just for her. Not the usual crowd of investors and socialites, but regular folks, teachers, nurses, delivery drivers who saved up for one fancy night out. They'd sit quietly, drink their modestly priced wine, and listen like their souls needed it. And maybe they did. One evening, a young woman approached her after the set, eyes red-rimmed but smiling. "I've been thinking about quitting music," she said softly. "Too hard. Too much rejection. But hearing you tonight, it reminded me why I started." She didn't know what to say, so she just hugged her. And in that hug, she felt the ripple of what she was doing. Not just playing piano, but giving people permission to keep going, to keep creating, even when the world says it's not worth it. Then came the night the man with the teacup returned. She saw him the moment she walked in, same overcoat, same quiet presence. He sat in the same spot, ordered the same tea, and listened with the same deep attention. After her set, he didn't approach her right away. He waited until the room had mostly cleared, until it was just the two of them and the bartender stacking chairs. Then he walked over. "You play like someone who's lived," he said, his voice warm but weathered like old wood. "Not like someone trying to impress," she smiled. "I'm not trying to impress anyone." "I know," he said. "That's why it works." He introduced himself then, not with a title, not with a list of accomplishments, but simply as someone who'd spent most of his life around music. He'd been a conductor once, decades ago, back when orchestras still rehearsed in drafty halls and musicians argued passionately about phrasing over cheap coffee. He'd stepped away years ago, disillusioned by the industry's obsession with image over substance. "I stopped believing music could still speak plainly," he said. "Tonight you reminded me it can." They talked for nearly an hour about phrasing, about silence, about how the best music isn't about technical perfection but emotional truth. He didn't offer her a record deal, didn't promise fame. He just listened. And in that listening, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. Before he left, he handed her a small notebook. "Write down your pieces," he said. "Not just the notes, the stories behind them. Because that's what people are really hearing." She took it, fingers brushing the worn leather cover. "Thank you," he nodded. "Keep playing. Not for them, for you. The rest will follow." After he left, she sat alone in the empty bar, the notebook in her lap. Outside, the city hummed its endless song, car horns, distant laughter, the rumble of a late-night train. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel separate from it. She felt part of it. Like her music wasn't something she did in spite of her life, but because of it. That night, she didn't go straight home. She walked through the quiet streets, the notebook tucked under her arm, listening to the sounds around her not as noise, but as potential music. The drip of a leaky faucet from a fire escape, the rhythmic thud of a basketball in a nearby court, the soft murmur of two friends saying goodnight on a stoop. She realized then that she'd spent so long thinking she needed a grand piano in a perfect room to make music. But the truth was, music was everywhere. It was in the way a bus brakes, in the sigh of a tired worker, in the quiet courage of showing up again after you've been told you're not enough. Back in her apartment, she opened the notebook and wrote her first entry, not a score, but a sentence. "This piece is about the night I remembered I was still an artist." She didn't know where this path would lead. Maybe nowhere, maybe somewhere beautiful. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because she'd already done the hardest part. She'd stepped back into the light, not as someone trying to prove herself, but as someone finally ready to be herself. And that, more than any applause or business card or standing ovation, was the real victory. The next morning, she woke early, made coffee, and sat by the window with the notebook open. She didn't rush. She just listened to the city, to her heart, to the quiet voice inside that had never really stopped singing. Then she began to write. The days that followed didn't feel like a rise to something grand. They felt like a slow, steady return to herself. She still woke before sunrise, still made coffee in the same chipped mug, still took the same subway line with its familiar rattle and screech. But everything felt different now. Not because her life had changed overnight, but because she had. The fear that used to coil in her stomach every time she thought about music had loosened its grip. In its place was something quieter, more resilient. Trust. Trust that she still had something to say, and that it was worth saying, even if only to an empty room. She kept playing at the bar, night after night, but she stopped thinking of it as a performance. It became more like a conversation. Some evenings she played pieces she'd written years ago, dusting them off like old letters. Other nights she improvised, letting the mood of the room guide her fingers. If the crowd was tired, she played something soft and slow, like a lullaby for grown-ups. If they were lively, she'd weave in playful rhythms, little surprises that made people smile without knowing why. Word spread, not through flashy ads or social media campaigns, but the old-fashioned way, through whispers, through recommendations, through people telling friends, "You have to hear her." The bar began filling up earlier, not with the usual crowd of well-dressed patrons looking to impress, but with people who came for the music alone, a retired schoolteacher who brought her own thermos of tea, a young couple on their first real date, holding hands under the table, a jazz drummer from Brooklyn who sat in the back, nodding along like he was hearing a secret only musicians understand. One night, after her set, a woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "My husband passed last month," she said, voice trembling. "He loved piano music. I haven't been able to listen to any until tonight. Thank you for giving me a way back." She didn't know what to say, so she just held the woman's hand for a moment. No grand words, no empty comfort, just presence. And in that silence, something passed between them that no song could fully capture, but that music had made possible. That was the thing no one had told her when she was younger, when she thought success meant concert halls and critics' praise. The real power of music wasn't in how many people heard it, but in how deeply it reached the ones who did. Still, the world outside the bar hadn't gone quiet. A few days after her first impromptu performance, the manager handed her a stack of business cards, some from music producers, others from talent scouts, even a representative from a small indie label. One card had a handwritten note, "Call me. I don't sign artists, but I'd like to talk." She tucked them into a drawer without calling anyone, not out of pride but caution. She'd seen too many stories, friends who'd been promised the world only to be molded into something unrecognizable, their art trimmed and polished until it lost its soul. She wasn't against opportunity. She just wanted to make sure it didn't cost her the one thing she'd just gotten back, her voice. Instead, she focused on what she could control. She started writing more. Every morning before the city fully woke, she'd sit by the window with the notebook the older man had given her and fill its pages, not just with notes but with fragments of life, a melody inspired by the sound of rain on her fire escape, a chord progression that mirrored the rhythm of her walk to the subway, a quiet refrain that came to her while watching an old man feed pigeons in the park. She also began practicing again, not the rigid, disciplined drills of her conservatory days, but something looser, freer. She'd play for an hour, then stop to make tea. She'd mess up a passage and laugh instead of cursing. She'd try something new just to see how it felt, not because it was correct. It wasn't about mastery anymore. It was about joy. One afternoon, she returned to the bar during daylight hours when it was empty and still. She asked the manager if she could use the piano for a few hours. He agreed without hesitation. She sat down and played for no one but the dust motes floating in the sunbeams. She tried out a new piece, one she'd been too nervous to play in front of anyone. It started slow, almost hesitant, then built into something bold and tender, like someone finally speaking their truth after years of silence. When she finished, she realized someone had been listening. The older man, the one with the teacup, stood in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets, a small smile on his face. "You're getting braver," he said. She laughed softly, or maybe just less afraid of being afraid. He walked over and sat at a nearby table. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a small venue downtown, intimate, good acoustics. They host local artists once a month. No pressure, no contracts. Just music." She hesitated. "I'm not ready for that." "Who said anything about being ready?" he replied. "You don't need to be ready. You just need to be willing." That stayed with her. Willing, not ready. There was a difference. Ready implied perfection. Willing meant showing up even if your hands shook. A week later, she agreed to play the venue. Not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted to test herself, to see if she could carry this new sense of self beyond the safety of the bar where she'd first rediscovered it. The night of the show, she didn't dress up. She wore the same simple black dress she always did. No jewelry, no fuss. She arrived early, walked onto the small stage, and sat at the piano without fanfare. The room held maybe 50 people, some familiar faces from the bar, others strangers. She didn't scan the crowd for approval. She just took a breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began. This time she played a full set of her own compositions. No standards, no covers, just her truth, note by note. She played the piece about loss, the one about hope, the one about walking home alone at 3 a.m. and seeing the city lit up like it was waiting for you. And when she played the final piece, the one she'd written the morning after her first night at the piano bar, the room didn't just applaud. They stood, not all of them, not in a dramatic movie-style ovation, but enough. Enough to make her throat tighten. Enough to remind her that connection wasn't about numbers, it was about resonance. Afterward, people lingered, not to take selfies or ask for autographs, but to talk. A teenager told her he'd been too scared to share his poetry, but hearing her play made him want to try. A woman said she'd come on a whim, feeling lost and left feeling like she'd been handed a map. The older man stood by the door, watching her with quiet pride, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. On the walk home, she didn't feel elated or overwhelmed. She felt calm, grounded, like she'd done exactly what she was meant to do, not for an audience, but for herself. Back in her apartment, she opened the notebook and wrote, "Tonight I didn't play to be heard. I played because I needed to speak." And somehow that's what made people listen. The next morning she got a call, not from a producer or a label, but from the manager of the venue. "We'd love to have you back next month," he said. "And if you ever want to record something, even just a demo, we've got a friend with a home studio. No pressure, just if you're interested." She thanked him and said she'd think about it, but this time the idea didn't scare her, because she knew now that her music wasn't something to be packaged or sold. It was something to be shared. And sharing didn't mean losing it, it meant letting it grow. She also finally called one of the numbers from the business cards. Not the flashy ones, but the one with the handwritten note. The man on the other end didn't pitch her, didn't talk about markets or demographics. He just said, "I heard you play. I'd like to help you share your music if you ever want to." No strings. They met for coffee a few days later. He was in his 60s, wore a rumpled sweater, and spoke slowly, like every word mattered. He'd worked in the industry for decades, but had stepped away from the big labels years ago. Now he helped independent artists record and distribute their work on their own terms. "I don't make stars," he said. "I help people stay true while they're being heard." She liked that. Liked him. And for the first time, she considered the idea of recording, not for fame, but so her music could reach someone sitting alone in a hospital room, or driving late at night, or just needing to feel less alone. But before any of that, she kept playing, kept writing, kept walking through the city with her ears open, collecting sounds like treasures. One evening, as she left the bar after her set, she saw a young girl standing outside with her mother, peering through the window. She looked about 10, clutching a small keyboard under one arm. "Did you really play in there?" the girl asked, eyes wide. She knelt down. "I did. My teacher says I should practice every day," the girl said. "But sometimes I get tired." "That's okay," she said gently. "Music isn't about never getting tired. It's about coming back when you're ready." The girl smiled. "Will you play again tomorrow?" "I will." "Good," the girl said, as if that settled everything. Then she turned and skipped down the sidewalk, her keyboard bouncing against her hip. She watched her go, heart full, and in that moment she understood something simple but profound. Her journey wasn't just about reclaiming her own dream. It was about making space for others to believe in theirs. She walked home under a sky full of stars, the city humming its endless song around her. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was fighting against the current. She was part of it, flowing, creating, becoming, not a star, not a sensation, just a person playing her truth one note at a time, and that, she realized, was more than enough. The nights grew cooler as autumn deepened and the city took on a different rhythm, slower, more reflective, like it was gathering its breath before winter. She still played at the piano bar, but now it wasn't just a job or even a second chance. It was home. Not the kind with 4 walls and a lease, but the kind you carry inside. The place where you finally feel like you belong. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped pretending to be someone else. She'd stopped counting the nights. Stopped wondering if this was enough. Because enough wasn't a number of listeners or a record deal or a headline. Enough was the quiet nod from a stranger who'd been crying silently in the back row. Enough was the teenager who came back 3 weeks in a row just to hear a certain piece. Enough was the way her fingers no longer trembled when they touched the keys. Not because the fear was gone, but because she'd learned to play through it. One evening, as she walked into the bar, she noticed the older man, the one with the teacup, already seated in his usual spot. He didn't wave or call out. He just gave her a small, knowing smile, like he'd been waiting not just for her to arrive, but for this moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to. She played a new piece that night. One she'd written just that morning, inspired by the sound of leaves skittering across the sidewalk and the way the light hit the windows of the old bookstore on her block. It started with a single repeating note, like a heartbeat, then unfolded into something tender and questioning, full of space and silence. She didn't try to fill every moment with sound. She let the music breathe, and in those pauses something deeper happened. People leaned in, not to hear more notes, but to feel what wasn't being said. After the set, the man approached her. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how music used to be a conversation between people, not a product to be sold. You've brought that back." She shook her head. "I'm just playing what's in me." "That's the rarest thing of all," he replied. Then he reached into his coat and handed her a small envelope. "I'm stepping back," he said gently. "Not from music, from the noise around it. But before I go quiet, I wanted to leave you with this." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter and a key. The letter was short, just a few lines. "The piano in my old studio is yours if you want it. It's not fancy, but it's honest. And so are you. Keep playing, not for the world, but for the truth." She looked up, but he was already walking away, coat pulled tight against the evening chill. She didn't chase him. She just held the key in her palm, warm from his hand, and felt the weight of what he'd given her. Not just a piano, but a blessing. A week later, she visited the studio. It was on the top floor of a brick building in the West Village, down a hallway that smelled of old wood and dust. The room was small, with tall windows that let in soft gray light. In the center sat an upright piano, its finish worn but cared for, keys slightly yellowed with age. She sat down, pressed a single key, and smiled. It sounded like home. She didn't move the piano into her apartment. She couldn't, even if she'd wanted to. But she started spending mornings there, writing, practicing, sometimes just sitting in silence. It became her sanctuary. Not a place to chase success, but to return to herself. Meanwhile, life outside the music kept moving. She still worked shifts at the bar, not because she had to anymore, but because she liked the rhythm of it. The clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the way the room changed with the hour. She'd learned that art didn't have to exist in isolation. It could live alongside laundry, rent checks, and subway delays. In fact, maybe it needed to. One afternoon, she got a call from the small indie venue downtown. "We've had a cancellation," the manager said. "Would you be willing to do a full evening next Friday? Just you, the piano, and whoever shows up." She said yes, not because it was a big opportunity, but because it felt right. The night of the show, she arrived early. The room was simple. Wooden floors, string lights, chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around the piano. No stage, no spotlight, just space. She sat down, ran her fingers over the keys, and waited. People came. Not hundreds, not even dozens. Maybe 30 souls wrapped in scarves and carrying the weight of their own days. She didn't introduce the pieces. She just played. A song about her grandmother's hands. A melody born from a sleepless night after a fight with a friend. A bright skipping tune inspired by the way pigeons strutted across the sidewalk like they owned the place. Halfway through, she noticed a familiar face in the front row. The young girl who'd stood outside the bar months ago, now sitting beside her mother, eyes wide with wonder. The girl gave her a tiny wave. She smiled back and played the next piece just for her. When she finished the final song, a quiet, hopeful piece about second chances. The room didn't erupt in cheers. They sat in silence for a long moment, as if letting the last note settle into their bones. Then slowly they began to clap, not out of obligation but gratitude. Afterward, people lingered, not for photos or promises but for connection. A man told her he'd brought his wife because she'd been grieving, and tonight was the first time he'd seen her smile in months. A college student said he'd been thinking of dropping out of music school, but hearing her play made him want to stay. The older woman with silver hair, the one who'd closed her eyes during her very first performance, approached and simply said, "You've grown." And she had. Not louder, not flashier, but deeper. On the walk home, she passed a busker playing saxophone on the corner. She stopped, dropped a few bills in his case, and listened for a moment. The music was rough, imperfect, full of life. She smiled. This was what it was all about, not perfection, but presence. Back in her apartment, she opened her notebook and wrote, "I used to think music was something I had to earn. Now I know it's something I get to give." She never signed with a big label, never went viral, never played on late-night TV. But she did record a small collection of her pieces, just 5 songs, in the older man's studio, with the help of the quiet producer who'd called months ago. They released it online with no fanfare, just a simple title, "For the Ones Who Listen." It didn't chart. It didn't need to. But letters started arriving, emails, handwritten notes, even a few voice messages. A nurse in Oregon said she played it during her night shifts to stay calm. A teacher in Ohio used one piece to help her students understand emotion without words. A man in Toronto wrote that he'd played it at his father's memorial, and for the first time the grief felt bearable. That was the real measure. Not streams or sales, but the quiet ripples her music made in other people's lives. One evening, as she prepared for her regular set at the bar, she saw the older man walk in again. He looked thinner, frailer, but his eyes were the same, deep, kind, full of music. He ordered his usual tea and sat in the back. She played the entire set with him in mind, not to impress, but to honor. She played the piece she'd written the night she first stepped back to the piano. She played the one about loss. She played the one about hope. The one about walking home in the rain and feeling, for the first time in years, like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. When she finished, he stood slowly, walked over and placed a single white lily on the piano lid. Then he touched her shoulder just once and left without a word. She never saw him again, but she kept the lily pressed between the pages of her notebook, right next to the note he'd left her that first night. Months passed. Seasons turned. She kept playing, kept writing, kept showing up, not because she was chasing a dream, but because she'd finally learned to live inside it. One night, as she sat at the piano before the crowd arrived, she didn't think about the past or the future. She didn't wonder if anyone would come, or if they'd like what she played. She just placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and listened to the hum of the city outside, to the quiet beat of her own heart, to the music that had never really left her, just waited patiently for her to return. Then she began to play, not for fame, not for validation, not even for the audience. She played because it was who she was, and in that simple, unshakable truth she found everything she'd ever needed.